On the 23rd of April of 1982, Sinclair Research launched into the market a machine that came to be my very first experience with a computer. It was highly affordable compared to the other monsters that were around by that time, and that was a huge advantage for families that wanted to get into the IT world without having to sell their houses or anything like that. Back then it was like selling a car to buy gasoline. So it became one of the first mainstream audience-owned computers in Europe, mainly in the UK and Portugal. In fact, Timex Portugal made some official clones of the ZX Spectrum to be sold in the United States, a result of a Sinclair and Timex joint venture. Unfortunately, programs and video games stored in audio cassettes just wasn't what that particular market was looking for. This 8-bit computer was so easy to program that hundreds of young kids on their own bedrooms dedicated their free time not only playing games but also making them. That's how many classics like Manic Miner came to be. So, all the success of the ZX Spectrum came from the games that these young kids, ranging between 14 and 18 years old, made at home, trying to replicate the ones they saw at the arcades. And to get some acknowledgement from this flourishing community, tapes with their games rapidly and massively started being duplicated and passed through in schoolyards and even sent by mail across all Europe. There were even radio shows that, at a specific time of day, mostly at night, would broadcast computer programs and simple and basic games that the listeners could simply record with a pretty standard tape recorder. It was the case with the Datorama show on Bristol's Radio West that started to transmit computer data by around July of 1983 after its clearance from the Broadcasting Authority. Many others followed all over Europe. Believe it or not, Piracy was the main responsible for the massive and enormous success of the ZX Spectrum, and these early years were crucial for its establishment as leader of the home computer market in the old continent. I have many fond memories of those amazing and memorable times when, in Portugal, the only source for news and novelties were the scarce British and Spanish magazines that started to arrive after the Spectrum boom across all Europe, and as well a 5-minute per week TV show about video games hosted by Paul Dimas, a kind of YouTuber from those glory days that, with his passion and enthusiasm, contaminated all of us. I blame him for making me love so much video games and all things related to it. Clive Sinclair, the brain behind these machines, received a few years back a knighthood from the Queen herself for his services to British industry. The ZX Spectrum led to a huge explosion of newborn companies that produced software and hardware for it, and it is seen as the machine that launched the IT industry not only in the UK but all over Europe. The ZX Spectrum was the follow-up and a huge improvement over the monochromatic ZX81, and Portuguese people were always receptive to technological advances. So the ZX Spectrum was a big opportunity for families to have a computer in their own houses, cause its price was really attractive and everyone had already a cassette player laying around at home. As opposite to the UK and other European countries, Portugal didn't have back then any kind of fiscal control that could protect the intellectual properties of software creators. So it was a huge deal for local electronics and computer dealers to grab the latest hits coming from the United Kingdom and Spain and make tons of copies to be sold really cheap, beginning with a simple and generic cover with the name of the shop front and center and the game's title on the spine of the case. Portuguese Anti-Piracy Law 109 was finally introduced in August of 1991. The crime of selling pirated video games would be, from that moment on, punished with a 3-year incarceration, and the establishment could even be permanently closed down. So, electronics and computer stores owners that used to make copies to be sold at much lower prices, as low as 75 cents, had to start selling originals. I recall this awkward moment when I was about to play 1984's Bruce Lee, and instead of that typical loading sounds, I got this! The fuss was so huge behind the counter that this kind of mistakes could easily happen. Later, cassette duplication would become more and more professional, with full color covers and even Portuguese instructions or just a basic resume describing the game. Usually, these would cost somewhere around 1 and 2 euros, and a perfectly normal practice till early 90s. Few saw this video game business as a huge opportunity to make money, but the ones that really had that vision of things to come made a fortune overnight. I recall this one place that had this wall filled with double-deck duplicators, and while we waited for the copy to finish, we could test the latest hits that would be running on a couple of ZX Spectrums. This practice would later evolve to the Amiga, and those shops needed to keep up with the evolution. I began to suspect that something wasn't right when I started to buy British and Spanish magazines, and ended up realizing that most games were available in cardboard boxes, and I recall thinking that I was being cheated in some way. So my attitude towards that situation was to go to one of my local vendors, select a game, take it home, make a copy, and in the next day return it saying that it didn't work, and then bring the one that I really wanted. Was I stopping piracy by doing that? Not at all, but in my head I was teaching a lesson to those guys for selling cheap alternatives to those gorgeous looking boxes available in other countries. Obviously that this wasn't at all a Spectrum-only issue. This was a common practice also for other home computers from the 80s, the ones that had the biggest fan base in Portugal, like the Commodore 64 and later the Amiga. As you know, and as I already mentioned in PixelThing's episode 62, piracy wasn't just placing a tape on the cassette player and make a copy, if you had a very expensive double-deck system, obviously. There were also amateur radio hobbyists that were also into video games and generous enough to share games with their neighbors through the air, just like a normal radio station that we could tune in and record. Piracy was also a huge problem in Spain, so Spanish publisher Herbe Software came up with a well-received anti-piracy campaign that would allow gamers to get brand new and original titles for a fraction of the price, eradicating almost completely piracy in the Iberian Peninsula. PixelThing's episode 49 tells this exact story, so feel free to check that one out. Back then at school it was really easy to find colleagues that also had a Spectrum and from whom we could borrow some games to make our own 60 or even 90-minute compilation of games. Others would also bring newspaper pieces with the latest tips and tricks to help us in those more difficult levels. The famous Pokes would also offer special features in-game, like for instance unlimited energy or infinite lives. I remember drawing some maps to help my friends find their way through those maze-like levels and pointing out the exact spot of those scattered special items so that they would not waste precious time searching for those. This was how we shared the information in an offline era like the 80s, so I could say that the Spectrum brought people together and a true community spirit was built. The ZX Spectrum was responsible for this passion of mine for video games and for many friendships that endure till this present day. 1986 was the year when Amstrad bought Sinclair Research, but Sinclair's last breath was probably the nowadays highly coveted 128K made in Spain a year before. This was, with no doubt, what the ZX Spectrum Plus should have been, with more memory and a magnificent AY sound chip. The Spanish video game market was thriving, and Sinclair convinced its Spanish partner and retailer Investronica to invest in the development of a brand new gaming machine. This was the very first time that Sinclair marketed one of their machines exclusively as a gaming platform. So the 128K, also known as the Toast Rack, was born. In case you're wondering, the Toast Rack nickname is due to the heatsink present on the right side of the machine. To keep its full compatibility with ZX Spectrum's huge library, this handy menu was introduced that allowed users to commute between 48K and 128K modes. But sadly, the model was short-lived. After its Spanish debut in September of '85 and in February of '86 in the UK, Amstrad bought Sinclair Research for £5 million by April, and by September rushed a brand new and redesigned 128, instantly killing the Toast Rack. The Plus 2 was born, based around the 128 hardware, and was the equivalent of Amstrad's own CPC 464 with its own incorporated tape recorder. The Plus 2 was an instant success, selling more than 300,000 units in the first 6 months. Even so, designers and publishers played it safe, making games for this brand new machine that were still compatible with the good old 48K, cause there were millions of users all over Europe. So what developers did was to make 128K versions of older 48K titles, applying this same rule for most of the newer games that were about to arrive. These 128K versions would mainly incorporate brand new intro and in-game music, and in some cases more levels, enhanced gameplay, and even all levels loaded in one go that would obviously take up to a dozen minutes of wait time. Nonetheless, Amstrad managed to breathe new life into the Spectrum, extending its commercial lifespan into the 90s, something that Sinclair Research was clearly unable to pull off by themselves. Ocean Software was the company that backed the Spectrum 128K from the very beginning, and many of their titles are among my favorites on the system. A while back I talked about the huge importance that video games covers had in the 80s and early 90s. Please check PixelThing's episode 73 to know more. So, after the cover, the next big thing we would be staring at was the loading screen. And we would be looking at these for 5 or more minutes. Damn, we could go and prepare a whole meal whilst the game was loading, and pray for that demonic tape loading error message didn't pop up in the process. Thinking of that, my Plus 2A had this strange and annoying problem that prevented the games to load. In the middle of the loading process, my Spectrum would reset 99% of the time. Did you also have this problem with any of your Spectrum models back then? I sorted this issue out simply by pressing the Enter key from the minute I wrote the loading command and pressed play on the data recorder, so I would be staring at those gorgeous pixel art screens during the whole loading process. Obviously that I would get around that inconvenience by placing something heavy on top of the Enter key. Bear in mind that a loading screen isn't synonymous of a great game. There were times that I would load a game up just to stare at those gorgeous pieces of pixelated art, and that's what it really is, art. Cover media, as we know it, started appearing in video game-related magazines in October of 1987, in Crash issue 45, when they had to increase the end price of the magazine due to the normal raise of paper costs and of the higher number of full-color pages. After that issue 45, the formula was repeated in number 54 in July of 1988, in issues 58, 59 and 60 from November and December of 88 and January of 89 respectively, issue 63 from April of 1989, and then in a monthly basis, starting with issue 65 published in June of 1989. But it all began in the 1960s with 7-inch vinyl flexi discs that later became really popular when those started to bring real audio tracks, making the magazines really appealing to buyers but also to thieves. Back to video games related stuff, Sinclair User also adopted this trend in its issue 72 from March of 88, dedicated to the ZX Spectrum. Ace magazine followed, and this one covered every home computer of that time: the ZX Spectrum, C64 and 128, Amstrad, Amiga, Atari ST, IBM PCs and more, being, if I'm not mistaken, the first British magazine to bundle cover tapes in their monthly publication. So in issue 9, published in June of 88, there was a cover tape with Impossible Mission, the complete game, for the Spectrum, Commodore, Amstrad and BBC Micro, all in one tape. And in the following month, the Atari ST and Amiga would get a brand new publication that would start bringing right from the beginning cover discs filled with awesome stuff for these amazing 16-bit machines. In Spain, that practice started with the still fortnightly Micro-Obi and its issue 182 from December of 1988, a time when Spanish software development was on its peak, with so many awesome releases for 8 and 16-bit home computers. Its cover tapes were filled with demos, mostly from Spanish developers, and in special occasions like Christmas time, they used to bundle with the magazine not one but 2 tapes with also complete games. As we saw in PixelThing's episode 73, cover tapes and discs were hugely important for gamers in the 80s to begin acquiring video games after playing the demo that came bundled with magazines and not by just looking at their covers.